Good morning and welcome to Worship Matters. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties that we had to take care of, so we had to cut it off, but here we are again. Worship. This program is looking into what worship is, possibly what it isn't, where it comes from, the history through the ages in the church, how it has changed and evolved over the centuries. And then we will be looking into the specific history and the story behind some of our beloved favorite hymns. This first session, we will be looking at the very beginnings of worship in the early Christian church going into the Reformation. Worship. What is worship? Worship has been written about and has been known for a very, very long time. And many different cultures, many different faiths and religions have worship. But we will be looking into the Christian worship, and we may touch on how Christian worship might have been influenced by outside influences as well. There are going to be some controversial things covered, but it is very fascinating and very interesting repertoire. One thing I did find out and that I did realize is that the early Christians were not that terribly different from the Jewish people. In fact, there was no real clear-cut line other than the Christian Jews accepting Christ as the Messiah. Musically speaking, the repertoire was very much the same. Reading of the Torah, the chants and the songs didn't just change overnight. They were still Jewish people, but they were just following Christ and brought in that whole new element into their day-to-day beliefs. Later on, with the Greek and the Romans coming into the Levant and the Holy Land, we see that they started converting to Christianity, and their styles and flavors started coming in. So the first song that we are going to look at actually comes from the Orthodox tradition. And the Orthodox began with the Greeks. There seems to be a little bit of an argument, who were the first Christians? Who was the first church? Was it the Romans? Was it the Greeks? But it certainly would appear that it was very well the Jewish people first and then Greeks. Now, the Orthodox Church, of course, very rapidly spread throughout the Middle East, spread into Turkey, spread into Eastern Europe, all the way up to Romania and Poland and Russia. You get the Eastern Orthodox churches, as well as Egypt. There's a branch in Egypt, and spread throughout Africa as well. The piece I'm going to be playing and presenting to you is very much authentic and is originally Arabic. Now, unfortunately, I don't speak Arabic, so it was good to find an English translation of this, and it is called the Paschal Troparium, and it is a trope, and in liturgical repertoire, a trope is usually a short response or a short chant that is sung in the midst of a greater work, or it is sometimes used as a call, like a calling. So this is the calling to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. One thing I want to point out is that ancient music, which this is, sounds very different to our modern ears, especially in connection with the church, what we consider church in the West, in the European tradition, in the North American tradition. So this is going to sound really, really different. He makes big use of what is known as the drone. So in church terms, it's called the cantus firmus, or the set bass. Actually, it's not a cantus firmus, it's actually the melody line. but this is definitely a drone, which is a big feature of ancient repertoire and ancient music. The tonal structure of the melody is very fascinating. It is definitely a Middle Eastern ancient melodic line, using the modes of that part of the world. So I shall now go to the Pascal Troparian.
Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tomb bestowing life.
So as you can hear, really, really different sounds. For those of us who are familiar with some Middle Eastern repertoire, if you think of popular folk songs like Hava Nagila from Israel, uses a very, very similar tonal structure, a particular kind of mode, which is strange to most of us Westerners unless you've been exposed to that sounding music. So once the Greek church, the Orthodox, began to spread throughout the Middle East, heading throughout Africa and then heading up north into Eastern Europe, we get to the Church of Rome. Now, it's really hard to say exactly when the Romans began following Christ, because it was never recognized officially, and actually the Roman Christians did go into hiding a lot of the time. It was definitely underground subversive movement. It was not very popular with the state religion of Rome at the time, which, as you know, worshipped deities like Jupiter and Diana and all that. So definitely the Roman Christians were in hiding. However, when Constantine the Great came into power, he did make it the official state religion of Rome. And then, of course, the doors just burst wide open. Looking at the musical repertoire of the time, before it became an official state church, the music would have most likely have been influenced by the Middle East. I have seen some writings talking about the early Church of Rome actually having music sounding very much like synagogue music. So they definitely, everything bloomed from the Holy Land and then spread out. So in the beginning, everything sounded very much familiar in the Middle Eastern context. But then when the Church of Rome became established, and then it was the State Church of Rome, Pope Gregory, after which the Gregorian chants are named, set out a commission to gather up and establish a set corpus of chants. At the time, and this is something people need to realize, is that in ancient times, even more so than today, there were many different flavors of church, many different flavors and different expressions of the Christian faith. And in the Church of Rome context, all the different states of the Holy Roman Empire had a different flavor and a different taste in their music and in their worship. And they had different kinds of chants. So we see things like the Mozarabic chants from Iberia, from Spain and Portugal, because there was definitely influence from the Middle East when the Arabs moved into that part of the world. We have the Gallic chant from Gaul, from France, and that had a definite flavor of that region. We have the Psalm plain chants, which are from Britain, from Salisbury, at a time when that was a Church of Rome area. So every region had its own different flavor, and it's very fascinating because they're sometimes they're kind of close. Really, the Mozarabic chants sound very much like the one I just presented to you from the Orthodox, that very Middle Eastern sound. So I'm going to sing a Gregorian chant here for you. One thing that also needs to be pointed out, particularly when it comes to the Orthodox as well as the Church of Rome, is that instruments were not very often used. Chanting was usually done unaccompanied, which we call a cappella in today's musical terms, which strangely enough means from the church or of church, in other words, in the style of church. So the whole idea of church music generally not including instruments is pretty common. So that Arabic Orthodox chant I gave you probably would not have been accompanied. However, in the Middle East itself, things are different. With the Orthodox churches of Europe, there definitely is, from Greece onwards, there definitely is no musical instruments allowed. I had an acquaintance from Cyprus who was Greek Orthodox, and he mentioned to me, upon my digging and asking about his church that he attended, is that choral music was very big. 4, 5, 6-part harmonies, choral repertoire, but it was all unaccompanied. And they use the idea of everything that has breath, praise the Lord, but instruments, I suppose some people would say about flutes and organs use wind, so in a way that could be breath. But no, in the Eastern Orthodox churches, definitely it's a cappella singing. Same with the Church of Rome. Instruments were not to be used in church, they were viewed as profane. And why exactly that attitude came in, I did a little bit of digging into early church and early Christianity. And the early converts, particularly the first Jewish Christians, were living in an area where they were surrounded by a lot of other cultures with other religions that worshiped other deities. So the idea of using music in particular to address and worship deity, even outside of the concept of the Judeo-Christian faith, was global, and it was very well known. The Greeks, for example, were very well known for their beautiful big choirs, where they would present some of the most beautiful music at their temples. And the use of instruments was very, very, very prominent during that time in the Middle East, in the ancient world, with worshiping their deities. So the early converts really wanted to cut ties and break away as much as possible. That's not to say that they just abandoned and dropped their instruments, but gradually it was, they wanted to not tone down their worship as in making it meaningless, but they wanted to break ties with identity with the other cultures that were surrounding them. And this seems to have gone over into the Orthodox and the Church of Rome as well, where musical instruments and playing thereof was seen as profane and was definitely linked with the ancient pagan past. So I shall now sing for you a Gregorian chant called Coordinatus ex Parentis. Now this is usually sung right about the Christmas season. It's talking about Christ being born from the heart of God, the love of God. One thing that I did notice very, very strongly is how challenging it can be for writers to translate a text from ancient, essentially extinct language into a modern living language of today. Sometimes the ideas are there, but the words aren't. In the Middle East, for example, they have many different ways of expressing a similar thing, but they make differences. Classical example is with the Greeks, the different words for love, and they all mean something specific, whereas in English we will say, oh, I love my mom and dad, I love my husband, and I love ice cream. So, where's the distinction? What kind of love are you talking about? But definitely in many ancient languages there is a distinction as to what type of love you are referring to. There's a love of your family, your parents, your children. There's a love of God, of deity. There's a love of your fellow man, the community. And then, of course, there's the love between a husband and wife. So, in this case, the English translation of the chant is of the Father's love begotten, which is good, it's accurate, it gets the idea across. But one thing I noticed that was very fascinating with the original Gregorian chant is that it uses corde natus ex parentis. Corde, of course, meaning heart, which is implying love, but in my view, it's a little closer. It's a little bit more intimate and, from the heart of God, not just love in general, but from his heart. Born from parentis instead of pater. And that puzzled me a little bit. It would be interesting to look into why specifically that word was used. Pater being father, parentis being a progenitor, a parent. So it's very gender ambiguous or neutral right there. But other than that, in translating, the English gets the basic idea across. So I will be chanting it in Latin, and then I will chant it to you in English. And then after that, I will just play it at the organ, because later on, these Gregorian chants and plain songs were harmonized. As the centuries went by and the eons went by, the church started bringing in instruments, choirs, that fear of associating with the ancient pagan past, with their choirs and orchestras and instruments, eventually faded. And they started bringing instruments into the church and choirs. And all these plain songs began to be harmonized. So that harmony singers, as we all know, we're not all sopranos and we're not all tenors. So there's altos, there's basses, and so on and so forth. So right now I will do the Gregorian chant. I just need to give myself a note. Ordenatus ex parentis,
Ante mundi exordium, alpheto connominatus, ipse fons et clausula, omniumque sunt verunt, quae post futura sunt, saeculorum saeculis. Ipse iusit et creata, dixit ipset facta sunt, terra celum fossa ponti, trinarerum machina, quaeque in his vigens subalto, solis et lunae globo, saeculorum saeculis. Of the Father's love begotten, ere the worlds began to be, He is Alpha and Omega, He the source, the ending He, of the things that are, that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore. At his word the worlds were framed. He commanded, it was done. Heaven and earth and depths of ocean, in their threefold order one. All that grows beneath the shining of the moon and burning sun, evermore and evermore.
Now we move into the beginning of the Reformation. As we well know or have heard, that the Reformation was basically the result of a monk named Martin Luther, who discovered that the church of the day was not practicing inline scriptural truths. And as he looked more into it, of course, it became more and more glaring, and he had increasing problems accepting these things. It certainly would appear that his idea might have not been to actually start a whole new church, but to reform the church of the day. But as history proves, that didn't work out that way. The split did happen, and I believe he married a nun and produced a big household full of children. Probably the most popular piece that he wrote, A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, is in our hymnal. There are two different versions of the tune. The one being an arrangement. Johann Sebastian Bach was very well known to have taken Luther's hymns and arranged them, and sometimes even reharmonized them. He certainly was not the only one. There are many different versions of Luther's hymns, Bach's being but one. When I looked into the original, or as close to the original as possible, of Luther's hymns, again, to our modern Western ears, it sounds totally different. They used really different chords, they used different harmonies, they used different modal systems, and to our modern Western ears, it just sounds very, very strange, because we're talking about music that was still under the influence of the medieval music, but slowly beginning to move into the Renaissance period. Now, one thing with Luther's hymns is many times he did actually write the music for them. I have read numerous articles where scholars were questioning, and particularly they were talking about Luther's songs that he might have used popular tunes of the day, possibly even folk songs. To date, I can't actually confirm that. I did find an online Luther hymnal that looks very old, and they actually state where the tunes come from, and they're very, very, very old tunes. We're talking going back as far as 1525 for a greater majority of them. Just excuse me. One very fascinating thing that I did find with A Mighty Fortress Is Our God is that some people, and this was a German website, were questioning whether Luther actually wrote it. The reason for that is that during that time, there were other composers around too, but his greatest contender was a Johannes. Now, where on earth is that man's name? Okay, apart from Johann Sebastian Bach writing it. Johann Walter. Johann Walter was a very popular composer around about the same time, the early 1500s. He was mostly a choral writer. He composed a lot of choral repertoire. Very proficient in his writing. He wrote a lot of what's called polyphony. And in musical terms, polyphony is where your harmonic lines in this case in the four main voice types, are totally independent of each other and move all over the place. And it's very florid, very beautiful if a group of singers can pull it off really well. But it is very challenging repertoire. Now, this is typical for the 1500s. This bled over into the Calvinist repertoire too, which is very interesting because everyone thinks that the Calvinist movement was very staunch. You know, you've got to cut out all of this stuff. But yet, their repertoire had a lot of polyphonic settings for choirs too. So this Johann Walter was definitely involved somehow at the same time Luther was. However, there has been collected an old manuscript, handwritten, dating back to 1529. It is a hymn based on Psalm 46, and it is Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott. And at the bottom is Martin Luther's signature. So whether that puts to rest whether or not he wrote the hymn, well, it certainly does appear that he did. One thing I would like to point out with this hymn, it does, like I say, it does appear in our Presbyterian hymnal in two different settings. One is the more florid sort of Bachian style of arrangement where the melody, the tune is actually very standard and straightforward. The original, however, was very free-flowing. And some people might say, might even, show a little bit of Gregorian character to it because it's very free-flowing. As you will see when we get to the Calvinist repertoire, the same thing is there too. There isn't always a set meter for the songs. They're very free-flowing, and for some of us it's like, wow, really? That's how it sounded? And I was really stunned to find this. So I will sing for you first one verse in German. I will do the original authentic version first, and then I shall go to the organ and I will sing the English translation with the harmonies, of course, and then you can hear the differences. So just give myself a note.
Ein fester Burg ist unser Gott, ein guter Wehr und Waffen. Hilft uns frei uns aller Not, die uns jetzt hat betroffen. Der allböse Feind mit Ernst, der jetzt meint, groß Macht und viel Lust, sein grausam Rüstung liest. Auf Erd ist nicht sein Gleichen.
As you can hear, the rhythm is really different. Now for the English version.
A mighty fortress is
As you can tell from the character of the song itself, the music, as well as the very powerful lyrics from that psalm, that became known as Luther's psalm. It was often considered the battle cry of the Reformation movement. Now, in today's world, we like to steer clear of too many songs that deal with battle and fighting, and some people see a lot of the older songs like these as being militant. However, you need to understand the context from which it comes. Number one, it's a psalm. So if we are a scriptural church, we should have really no problem adopting texts and songs that are based on Scripture itself, straight from Scripture. And number two, from the historical perspective, Luther started the movement and followers quickly followed. And the church of the day, who was in power, did not like this. So in ancient times and old times, it really was not a problem for people to take up arms and do battle. Bloodshed is very much a part of history. It certainly was part of the Reformation movement, part of the Lutheran movement. Many people lost their lives when they left the old established church. We see that again with Calvin, the Calvinist movement. So it's a very, very powerful song, and definitely we should hold it close in our hearts as part of our history and understand where the people came from who wrote it and sang it. In this next segment, we're now moving on to the Calvinist movement. The Calvinist church began taking root in Switzerland a little later in the 1500s. So basically after the Lutheran movement, the Calvinist movement began. It's centered around Geneva. However, there are also centers in France that definitely started fostering this new Protestant, this French-speaking Protestant church. We need to understand that although it started in Switzerland and Lutheranism spread to Switzerland too, that this Calvinist movement was originally French-speaking. John Calvin's name is actually Jean Calvin. And today, the Calvinist movement moved into many different directions. We find things like, for example, Calvinist elements in the Church of Scotland, which is what our roots are, the Presbyterian Church. We fall definitely under that Calvin Reformed tradition. The Calvinist Reformed tradition moved on to the nether countries. So we have the Dutch Reformed Church. Again, coming from South Africa, that is one of the prominent churches that's split apparently into three different movements, but they are essentially Dutch Reformed Calvinist. I have heard of, I've never met anybody, but I have heard of a Hungarian Reformed movement, which I believe is also a Calvinist Protestant movement. As I mentioned about warfare and the state church not liking this dissident movements happening, the same thing happened with the Calvinists. Now in France, the reformers, the Protestants were called the Huguenots. And there was a battle that eventually took place where from Paris all the way down to southern France, the Protestants were being persecuted and they were being slaughtered by the thousands. And there was a big flee out of France, of course, so we find the Huguenot influence moving into other parts of Europe. Particularly into the New World they fled. We find it in Canada, we find it in the States. I believe that there is a very strong Huguenot influence also in Australia and, of course, South Africa, where we have... I actually tracked down a Huguenot church in South Africa. Whether or not they still worship in French, I'm not sure. So yes, bloodshed and fleeing was part of their deal too. Music plays today and played back then very much a really crucial part of worship. For us modern Western Christians, we see worship as being synonymous with the music. This is one thing that sometimes takes people by surprise, that worship can come in many different forms. It's not just music. I did a little research on the word worship, and also I was at a worship workshop once where it was explained to us that the word worship actually comes from an older word called workship. So, workship. The use of that word in a religious context actually dates all the way back to the Sumerians, where being in service of your God was one of the greatest privileges and honors that you could possibly have bestowed upon you. Now, when I say privilege and honor, I don't mean it in like an arrogant sense. They were very, very servile. There were certain ways that they would enter into the temples and service their gods that would indicate that they were being very, very humble. And that was a form of worship, working in the temple. Even menial things like sweeping and mopping the floors, dusting. If there are any images or statuary, these get cleaned. As we can see in many of today's religions that use icons and statues in their worship spaces, things like putting on flowers or clothing or decorations or something. And then when that goes away, it gets cleaned off, offering food. When that obviously doesn't get eaten, that gets, so worship, so everything to do with that. And in context of the Christian church, worship encompasses more than just the music. It is probably the more vibrant, the more out there form of worship, but it's not the only form of worship. If you have, for example, administrative assistants, what they are doing is actually for God and it is for His church, therefore it is actually worship. When your minister has no one else to go out and mow the lawn, he's doing it for God's house, he's doing it for God's people, and he's doing it in honor of God, so it is a form of worship. If lights need to be changed and there's somebody who comes in quickly and takes out dead light bulbs and puts them back in. Maintenance of the building, all sorts of phoning people. When your elders phone and make contact with people, that includes worship too. But like I said, music is probably the one that evokes emotion in people and is right out there and is super creative and is very vibrant. So the Calvinists definitely put in a lot of effort into their music. Where the Lutherans used psalms and also wrote other sets of music that were not necessarily the psalms. Some of them were taken out of scripture. Others was in a musical way Luther addressing people and calling them to holiness, calling them to following Christ, calling them to obeying God and being obedient, which is another part of our faith that is very important, that we sometimes overlook. So Luther was really much into that. Not that the Calvinists were not, however, the Calvinists focused heavily on the Psalms. In the beginning, it was just a small little collection of music that John Calvin was trying to pull together. And then eventually, with the help of such composers as Louis Bourgeois, who was a prolific writer and was very, very good with words. One of the things, I was talking with a close friend of mine, and I said, imagine taking 150 psalms, setting them to meter, which means the beat and the count of the music, like poetry. So one line has 8 syllables, one has 6, one has 8, one has 6, one has 8, so it's regular. So you're taking the psalms, you're putting them into a meter in another language other than the original language in which it was written, capture the essence of it and make it rhyme. It's poetry. And it is just incredible how these writers have done this. So I'm really quite moved when I think about the amount of work that goes into it. As a musician, and I've tried my hand at writing and composing and arranging too, it is really challenging to take something that inherently doesn't rhyme, is, like, it's free verse, but you want to put it into a meter and make that rhyme. That, by the way, does have a term. It's called a metrical psalm. And there are many metrical psalters out there. However, the Calvinists, I believe, were the first ones to come out with a metrical psalm. There was an English version later on when the Calvinist movement went into England, and it was called the Anglo-Genevan Psalter. So they used the same tunes, but they translated, of course, from the original French of the Genevan Psalms into English. And then, via all these movements, eventually some of them came into our movement, the Church of Scotland and the Presbyterians, where we do actually have Genevan Psalms in our hymnal too. Now, I'm not a native French speaker at all, so you will have to forgive me for any mistakes that I make in the pronunciation. This will be done at the organ. There seems to be very strong indication that the Calvinists were not afraid of using harmony. They were not afraid of using instruments. So definitely a lot of them had been arranged into 4 parts, sometimes even more. There's also polyphonic arrangements and writings specifically for choirs that are very, very complex of the Genevan Psalms. So I will sing to you the French. I'll sing one verse of a French psalm. It's Psalm 118, which in French they call Rendez à Dieu. And it's a tune that is used a lot in many churches. In our hymnal, for example, it is used in a communion hymn, Bread of the World in Mercy Broken. So those of you who know that hymn will immediately identify the tune. Then I will present an English translation of the psalm. I will also sing one verse of that. You will want to notice its free movement as well. It's very much like the original Luther Ein fester Buch. It's not constrained to the same time fragmentation of the music like a lot of other more modern Western music. It's very free-flowing, kind of has a slight Gregorian sound to it as well. It's a chanty sound. And then I will just, it's not on PowerPoint, but I will just play for you a piece. It's also a psalm, Psalm 42, as the deer pants for the water. Because one of the things that came forward, I wouldn't say accusations, but certainly people had made note that Louis Bourgeois, with the nod of Calvin, of course, had supposedly or allegedly adapted and adopted a whole lot of melodies that were popular at the time. Now, this is an interesting thing. because some of the tunes you definitely could think of as being folk music. Some of it was considered dance music of its time. Why does that sound so familiar? That's going on in today's churches too, where people are saying, we're bringing in music from the popular repertoire and the styles from the popular repertoire in, and we're playing dance music in our churches today. So it was happening back then too, and people were quite upset at the time, and others were like, it's nice, we know the tune at least. And I think maybe that might have been one of the reasons why they would have done that, is because people would have known the tunes already if they're using folk songs and popular dance music. Others are not. Some of the the Genevan Psalms can sound very, very austere, and I would say some of them are even a little dark in sound, in tone. But then, of course, the Psalms cover everything from the heights of absolute bliss to being persecuted and, calling out to God for help. So certainly the music would reflect that feeling. Now, the piece that I will play after the ones I sing, As a Deer Pants for the Waters, it could possibly have been a dance tune. And I will play it lively for you so you could hear it. In most churches, they slow it right down so that it sounds very, very churchy. But if you actually bring it up a little bit, upbeat, you could actually almost think, I could see some people in the Renaissance, playing their lutes and their recorders and their little drums and stuff and dancing in the streets to this tune. However, the Psalm 118 is a little different. It's a cheerful tune, but I believe that this was written originally for the psalm. Just a word of warning, old music, especially dating back to that time, is very high. This is something that I've been told over and over and over, and that I've done some digging and searching myself. I've got a huge collection of old hymnals, and I have seen that a lot of the older hymns are really high. And, most regular church goers today just simply would not be able to sing those high notes. So the original version that I'm going to sing for you of Rendez à Dieu is very high. The English translation, they brought it right down by almost 3 whole tones. So it's quite something. So I will have to give myself a new note to sing the English, if you will bear with me. So now I present Rendez à Dieu. As you can hear, there's a lot of happiness, a lot of joy, and it's very exuberant. So that possibly could have been a dance tune in my eyes, but it is so beautiful for that song. A lot of feelings of hope, a lot of joy, and a lot of happiness, and a lot of movement, and a very different sound from some of the more penitential, quiet, meditative songs. So that is our first program for today. We're sorry for the delay. Our next program will be now moving into, after the Reformation, we go now into the Church of England, which is a very fascinating story behind that, and we'll be looking at some of the liturgical pieces that the Church of England uses, and talk about their specific musical style. From that came the Methodist and the Wesleyan movements, so we'll be looking into that a little more. Then we will tackle John Knox. Well, we won't tackle him. We'll talk about John Knox and the Church of Scotland and how it eventually became the Presbyterian Church. So that is our installment for next time. We will do our next number 2. We will do it on a Wednesday. We'll do it on Wednesday again. We will make announcements about it, same time, same place. So all of you take care, and God bless, and be safe until then.